Picture this: an 18th century Prussian city, gray, probably a little damp. It is Königsberg. The year is roughly 1780. As the church bells chime, 3:30 in the afternoon, doors all along the street start to crack open. Just a little bit. Shopkeepers look up from their books. Housewives pause their work. They are not looking for the town crier or some grand event. They are looking for one man. A small, frail man in a gray coat, holding a Spanish cane, who has just stepped out of his front door. They are checking their watches. They are literally setting their watches by him. He is so punctual, so unbelievably precise, that his daily walk is the official town clock. If Professor Kant is late, the thought is not that he is delayed. The thought is that the church tower must be broken. That is the image we all have of Immanuel Kant, the human clock, the mechanical man. It is a caricature. It is where the popular understanding of him usually starts, and unfortunately, where it often stops. But that is just the surface. Today, we unpack the life of a man who is a walking paradox. This is a guy who never traveled more than 60 miles from his hometown. Yet his mind produced a map for the entire structure of human experience. He lived a life of robotic routine. But he is the philosopher who completely revolutionized our ideas of freedom and autonomy. It is one of the great ironies in all of history. You have this quiet, uneventful life on the outside. No great wars, no dramatic love affairs, no globe-trotting adventures. But inside his head, in his study, there he was setting off intellectual explosions that would level the philosophical landscape of Europe. He saved philosophy from total skepticism and defined the modern era. That is our mission today. We are going to get behind that gray coat and the famous Spanish cane. We have dug into the sources: biographies, major works, critiques, letters, and accounts from people who knew him. That is where you find the man behind the machine. The man who, for instance, had a serious obsession with English cheese. A detail which, spoiler alert, plays a surprisingly tragic role at the end of his life. We will get to the cheese. Before we dismantle the machine to see how it was built, take a moment to subscribe to History Titans and like this video to help us keep these stories alive. To understand the machine, we must go back to the very beginning. It starts in a humble place. April 22nd, 1724. Königsberg, East Prussia. Today, that is Kaliningrad, in Russia. Back then, it was a major German cultural center on the Baltic Sea, a hub of trade and ideas. His family was far from the intellectual elite. His father, Johann Georg Kant, was a harness maker, a master craftsman, a saddler. It was an artisan family with a working-class background. His childhood smelled like leather and glue. It was a life of manual labor and modest means. Immanuel was the fourth of 9 children. Like many families of that era, many of his siblings did not survive into adulthood. It was a tough, precarious existence. The religious atmosphere of his home defines this early period. The word pietism comes up over and over again. Pietism was an influential movement within Lutheranism at the time. It was a reaction against the dry, cold, intellectual side of the mainstream church. The church had become too focused on dogma, memorizing catechisms, and debating theological points. The pietists said no. Faith is not in your head. It is in your heart. They emphasized deep personal inner devotion, humility, sincerity, and a literal emotional reading of the Bible. For a young boy, that meant an incredibly strict, disciplined household. Lots of prayer, lots of soul-searching, a constant focus on your own sinfulness, and the need for grace. This carried over into his schooling. He attended the Collegium Fridericinum, run by a famous pietist headmaster. It was notoriously tough. The discipline was severe. The curriculum was brutal, heavy on Latin and Greek, but all in the service of religious instruction. Kant later said, he looked back on his school days with a kind of horror. He grew to dislike the dogmatic, oppressive religious aspect of it, but something stuck. This is the key to the whole man. The adult Kant moved away from organized religion. He was not a churchgoer. But he kept the structure of pietism. He internalized its discipline. The software changed, but the operating system stayed the same. He stripped away the hymns and the rituals, but that intense sense of duty, of a moral law within, as he would later call it, stayed. That inner voice telling him what he ought to do was forged in his pietist childhood. This education cost money. The family was already struggling. Then, in 1746, tragedy struck. His father died. Kant was only 22. Almost overnight, he became the head of the family. The family was left destitute. This part of his story often gets glossed over. We imagine philosophers in ivory towers. Kant had to hustle. He was broke. He had siblings to support. He had to drop out of the university. For the next 9 years, he worked as a Hofmeister, a private tutor. He left Königsberg for the only significant period in his life and went into the countryside, living on the estates of wealthy families. He was a live-in teacher, instructing their kids in everything: Latin, math, geography, etiquette. These 9 years in the wilderness were incredibly formative. It exposed him to different classes of society. He learned the manners and customs of the aristocracy. He learned how to be a charming conversationalist. More importantly, he was reading. He was studying on his own time, absorbing the latest in science, especially Newton and philosophy. Now, he finally returned to the university in 1755. He was 31 years old. He managed to complete his degree and became a private dozent. It sounds like a fancy academic title, but it was basically the gig economy of 18th century academia, an unsalaried lecturer. The university gave him permission to teach, but they did not pay him. He was paid directly by the students who chose to attend his lectures. They would literally pay at the door. If no one showed up, you did not eat. The pressure was immense. It forced him to be a brilliant lecturer. He could not be a dry, boring academic droning on about metaphysics. He had to be engaging, witty, clear. He had to sell tickets. He taught an incredible range of subjects: logic, metaphysics, physical geography, anthropology, even pyrotechnics and the theory of fortifications. He had to be a showman. This brings us to one of the biggest misconceptions about Kant: the idea that he was always this boring, reclusive old man. The young Kant, the private dozent trying to make a name for himself, was known as the elegant magister. Some biographers call him the party hound. He was a socialite. He was apparently quite dashing, though very short, just barely 5 feet tall. He had a sunken, concave chest, but he dressed in the latest fashions: gold-trimmed coats, powdered wig, a ceremonial sword at his side. He was a fixture in Königsberg high society. He was out on the town. He loved playing billiards. He was an avid card player, often staying out until midnight. He loved dining out. He was known for his wit and his incredible conversation. He was the guy everyone wanted at their dinner party. So what on earth happened? How do you get from the elegant magister playing cards until midnight to the human clock, whose neighbors set their watches by him? It seems to have been a kind of midlife crisis, but a very specific intellectual one. It happened right around his 40th birthday, in the mid-1760s. He seems to have had a profound realization that his time and energy were finite. He knew he had a great philosophical work inside him, a system that could change everything, and he realized that if he kept burning the candle at both ends, the socializing, the late nights, he would never complete it. He also had this persistent health anxiety. He was a lifelong hypochondriac. And it was not entirely in his head. That sunken chest was not just a cosmetic issue. It compressed his heart and lungs. He always felt physically frail, like he was operating with a limited supply of vital energy, a limited battery life. He believed he had to conserve every ounce of that energy for his thinking. So he made a conscious decision. He constructed the regimen. This routine is the stuff of legend. Let us break down the day in the life of the machine. It starts at 5 in the morning sharp every day. He had a servant, a man named Lampy, who was a retired soldier. Kant gave Lampy explicit and absolute orders. Wake me up at 5, no matter what. You must not let me oversleep, even if I beg you to. And apparently, Kant would often beg. He was not a natural morning person, so he had to use Lampy as an external enforcer of his own will. Once up, he would sit at his desk and drink 1 or 2 cups of very weak tea, and he would smoke 1 pipe of tobacco. Just 1 pipe a day. That was his rule. But there was a fantastic loophole he exploited. Over the years, as his craving for tobacco grew, he could not break the 1 pipe rule he had set for himself. So instead, the bowl of the pipe just got bigger and bigger. By the end of his life, it was apparently enormous, but it was technically still just 1 pipe. That is peak philosopher logic. Respect the letter of the law, if not the spirit. After the pipe, he would work, preparing his lectures. He taught at the university, from 7 until 11 in the morning, a 4-hour block. Then he would return to his study and write until lunchtime. Lunch was the centerpiece of his entire day, because it was his only meal. The original 1 meal a day diet. It was a production. It would start at 12:45 and could last for hours, sometimes until 4 or even 5 in the afternoon. And he had a strict rule about it. He refused to eat alone. Ever. He believed that dining alone was philosophically unhealthy. It was for beasts, not for rational beings. Eating with others, for him, was a moral act. It was about community and conversation. He invited a whole mix of people: friends, merchants, former students, visiting academics. He made a point of never inviting only other philosophers. He wanted to hear about the world, about trade, politics, what was happening in the city. He would serve wine, tell stories, and lead the conversation. For those few hours, the elegant magister came back to life. And then, when the long lunch finally wound down, came the famous walk. He would step out his door and the whole neighborhood would check their clocks. He always walked alone. He had a very specific hypochondriacal reason for it. He believed that breathing through your mouth was dangerous. He thought that if cold air hit his lungs directly, it would cause all sorts of illnesses, from colds to rheumatism. So if you are walking with someone, you have to talk. And if you talk, you open your mouth. So he walked alone, in total silence, breathing deliberately and exclusively through his nose, pacing the same route every single day. A route that became known in Königsberg as the philosopher's walk. After the walk, he would read and study until the evening. And then, at 10 at night, it was bedtime. Immediate sleep. He apparently had a specific technique for wrapping himself in his blankets, like a mummy or a cocoon, to ensure perfect warmth and stillness. And then, he was out like a light. He did this, more or less, for 40 years. It sounds so rigid, so stifling to us, but for him, this routine was not a prison. It was a fortress. It was a protective shell he built around himself to allow his mind to do its revolutionary work. And speaking of that revolution, we need to talk about the period when it was really brewing. The Silent Decade. This is such a fascinating period. In 1770, Kant finally gets the job he has wanted his whole life. He is made a full professor of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. He has tenure. He has job security. He is 46 years old. And then he basically stops publishing. Radio silence. For 10 years. From 1770 to 1781, the academic world was buzzing. They started to whisper, "What happened to Kant? Is he finished? He is a dry well." But in reality, he was deep in thought. He was wrestling with the single biggest problem in philosophy at the time. To understand what he was doing, you have to get the lay of the land. Philosophy, in the mid-18th century, was basically split into 2 big warring camps. On one side, you have the rationalists. These are men like Leibniz in Germany or Descartes before him. They believed that pure reason was a kind of superpower. They thought you could essentially sit in a dark room, close your eyes, and just by using logic and deduction, you could figure out the entire structure of the universe. You could prove that God exists, that the soul is immortal, that the world is fundamentally logical and orderly. For them, knowledge came from the mind. On the other side, you had the empiricists. mostly British thinkers like John Locke, and, most importantly for our story, the Scottish philosopher David Hume. The empiricists argued the exact opposite. They said all knowledge comes from experience, from our senses. If you cannot see it, hear it, taste it, or touch it, you cannot know it. Your mind at birth is a blank slate, a tabula rasa. Experience writes on it. And then Hume comes along and drops an intellectual bomb that, in Kant's own famous words, awoke me from my dogmatic slumber. The bombshell was about cause and effect, causality. It seems like the most obvious thing in the world. You hit a billiard ball with a cue stick, and you cause it to move. Event A causes event B. But Hume said, hold on. Let us look really closely at that. What do you actually see? You see the cue stick moving? Then you see it touch the ball. Then you see the ball start to move. You see a sequence of events. But, Hume says, you do not see the cause. You do not see the force or the necessary connection that links the two events. All you ever see is one thing happening, and then another thing happening. The idea of cause is just something our brain adds in, because we have seen it happen over and over. It is just a habit of the mind, a mental expectation. We expect the ball to move because it has always moved in the past. But, Hume argues, we have no logical, rational reason to be absolutely certain it will happen the next time. We cannot be 100% sure the sun will rise tomorrow, just because it rose every day before. That sounds like a philosophical parlor game. But when you think about it, the implications are devastating. They destroy everything. If you cannot rely on cause and effect, then all of science, all of Newtonian physics, which was the gold standard of knowledge, is just built on a lucky habit. It is not certain knowledge. And forget about metaphysics or proving God exists. It leads to total skepticism. We cannot really be sure of anything beyond our immediate sensations. Kant reads this. Kant reads Hume, and it shakes him to his core. He knows Hume is wrong in a way. Science does work. We do have reliable knowledge of the world. But he also knows Hume is right, logically. You cannot find causality out there in the world with a microscope. So he is trapped. He locks himself away for 10 years to solve this riddle, to try and find a third way. A way to save human knowledge from Hume's skepticism, without going back to the magical thinking of the old rationalists. In 1781, after a decade of silence, he drops the Critique of Pure Reason. It is a monster of a book. It is a beast, dense, jargony, notoriously difficult to read. He apparently wrote it in a frantic rush, just a few months after having thought about it for 10 years. But the central idea is so brilliant and so transformative that he calls it his Copernican revolution. Let us unpack that analogy. Copernicus, the astronomer, showed us that the sun does not revolve around the earth. It is the other way around. He flipped the center of the solar system. Kant flipped the mind. Before Kant, everyone assumed that our knowledge must conform to objects. There is a world out there with chairs and trees and planets, and our mind is like a passive mirror or a camera trying to get an accurate picture of it. That seems like common sense. But Kant flipped it completely. He said, what if instead of our knowledge conforming to objects, the objects must conform to our knowledge? What if our mind is not a passive mirror? What if it is an active factory? What if it actively structures the reality we experience? Our mind imposes rules on the world. He argued that the human mind comes with a pre-installed operating system. We are born with certain structures of understanding. For example, we have what he called the forms of intuition. These are space and time. So space and time are not just out there, part of the fabric of the universe. Kant's radical claim is, no, they are not. They are the glasses that are permanently stuck to our minds. We cannot experience anything except through the grid of space and time. They are the coordinate system our mind uses to organize all the raw data that comes in from our senses. If there were no human minds, there would be no space and time as we know it. That is the mind-bending conclusion. They are properties of our perception, not properties of the things themselves. This leads to the next layer, the solution to the cause and effect problem from Hume. He says that in addition to the glasses of space and time, our mind has built-in software. He calls them the categories of the understanding. There are 12 of them. Things like unity, plurality, substance, and the most important one, causality. We are hardwired to organize the world in terms of cause and effect. We cannot help it. It is a rule of our mental software. So the reason we can be sure that the cue stick will cause the ball to move is not because we have some deep insight into the nature of billiard balls. It is because we have deep insight into the nature of our own minds. Our minds can only process reality that way. That is the Copernican revolution. Causality is not something we discover out there in the world. It is something we project onto the world. We are the ones who make the world orderly and law-like. That is huge. It saves science, because science is now just the study of the rules of our own experience. It makes Newtonian physics valid and certain for the world as it appears to us. But, and this is a massive but, it creates a fundamental split in reality. A famous split. The split between phenomena and noumena. Phenomena is the world as it appears to us. The world processed through our mental glasses and software. This is the world of science. We can know this world. But the noumena is the world as it is in itself. Reality with the glasses off. The world behind the curtain. And Kant's stunning conclusion is that we can never, ever know this world. We can never know what a tree is really like outside of our perception of it. We can never know God or the soul or the ultimate nature of the universe. Never. They are beyond the limits of human reason. We can think about them. We can wonder about them. But we cannot have scientific knowledge of them. He famously said, "I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." He slams the front door of reason in the face of God, but he sort of leaves the back door of faith open for him. That provides a beautiful transition into the next great pillar of his thought, his ethics, because if we cannot know for a fact that we have free will or that there is a God, how can we even have morality? In the world of phenomena, everything is determined by cause and effect. I am just a physical body, a collection of atoms, so how can I be free? This is where we shift from his first critique, the critique of pure reason, which is about what we can know, to his work on practical reason, which is about what we should do. And Kant's move is brilliant. He says, look, we cannot prove we are free using science. Freedom is a noumenal idea. It is outside the system. It is outside the system of cause and effect. But, he says, we must act as if we are free. We have to postulate it. Because without freedom, the whole concept of morality makes no sense. You cannot be held responsible for your actions if you are not free to choose them. If I am just a biological robot whose actions are determined by my brain chemistry and my upbringing, you cannot praise me for being good or blame me for being bad. Ought implies can. If I tell you that you ought to do something, it implies that you can do it, so we have to assume we are free. What then? How do we know what the right thing to do is? This brings us to probably his most famous concept, the categorical imperative. It is one of those phrases everyone has heard. But what does it actually mean? Imperative just means a command. Categorical means unconditional. It applies to everyone, everywhere, at all times, with no exceptions, no ifs. The alternative is a hypothetical imperative. That is a command with an if. If you want to pass the exam, you should study. If you want to lose weight, you should exercise. The command depends on a goal you have, but the categorical imperative is just, you should do this, period. Not, do not lie if you want people to trust you. Just, do not lie. And he gives us a test, a kind of formula, to figure out what these unconditional moral duties are. This is the first formulation of the categorical imperative, the universalizability principle. It sounds very grand, but the idea is actually quite simple. He says, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. In plain English, before you do something, ask yourself, what if everyone on earth did this all the time? See, you take the rule or maxim of your action. Let us say your maxim is, when I am in a tough spot financially, I will lie to get a loan that I know I cannot pay back. Now universalize it. Imagine a world where everyone lives by that rule. Everyone lies to get loans they cannot repay. What happens to the world? The whole institution of promise-making and loan-giving would collapse. No one would ever believe anyone's promise. The concept of a loan would cease to exist. It self-destructs. The rule eats itself. It is a logical contradiction. And for Kant, that is the test of immorality. An immoral act is not just one that makes people sad. It is one that is fundamentally irrational. It is a glitch in the logical software of the universe. It is a very strict system, which leads to that famous and very difficult example that people always use to criticize Kant. The murderer at the door. The inquiring murderer. A known murderer comes to your door brandishing an axe and asks you if your friend, whom he intends to murder, is hiding in your house. You know for a fact that your friend is hiding in your closet. What do? Every normal human being says, you lie. You say no, have not seen him. I think he went that way. You save your friend's life. And Kant, in one of his later essays, says, you cannot lie. You must tell the truth. That is a tough pill to swallow. It feels monstrously wrong to our modern intuitions, which are very focused on consequences. Kant's reasoning, though, is that you are only responsible for the morality of your own action. Your duty is to uphold the moral law, which forbids lying. You are not responsible for what the murderer chooses to do with that information. That is cold comfort to a dead friend. He even adds a strange little addendum. He says, what if you lie and tell the murderer, your friend is not here? But unbeknownst to you, your friend has just snuck out the back door. The murderer leaves, runs into him in the street and kills him. Now Kant argues, because you lied, you were partially responsible for his death. That feels like a bit of a cheat. But it shows how deeply committed he was to this idea that morality is about duty and rationality, not about calculating outcomes. It is not our job to try and predict the future. It is our job to act rationally right now. There is a second version of his imperative, though, that I think is much more intuitive and, frankly, more beautiful. The humanity formulation. This is where Kant's ethics really sings. He says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. In short, do not use people. Do not treat another rational being as a mere tool for your own purposes. A hammer is a means to an end. You use it to drive a nail. You cannot do that to a person, because a person has intrinsic worth, what Kant calls dignity. They are an end in themselves. And this is really the philosophical foundation for our modern concept of human rights. The idea that every person has an inherent dignity that cannot be violated, that they cannot be bought or sold or used. That comes directly from this formulation. If I am friendly to you only because I want to borrow money from you, I am using you as a means. I am treating you as an ATM machine, not as a person. I am violating your dignity. All of this ties into his powerful idea of autonomy, self-law. For Kant, this is the definition of true freedom. Freedom is not doing whatever you feel like. That is a huge misunderstanding. Freedom is not just following your desires. For Kant, if I eat a whole cake just because I have a craving for sugar, I am not free. I am a slave. I am a slave to my biological programming, my desires. My stomach is giving me orders, and I am obeying. That is what he calls heteronomy. Law from the outside. Real freedom, autonomy, is when you act according to a rational law that you give to yourself. When you say, I have a desire for cake, no, but I also have a rational principle to be healthy, and I choose to follow my reason. That is freedom. You are governing yourself. You are rising above your animal nature. So freedom is obedience to a law which we prescribe to ourselves. It is the freedom to do what you ought, not just what you want. Let us zoom out a little. We have talked about his theory of knowledge and his ethics, But Kant was living through an incredibly turbulent time. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the whole world was changing. How did he apply these ideas to politics? He was a massive champion of the Enlightenment. In 1784, he wrote a short but hugely influential essay asking the question, what is enlightenment? And his answer is so powerful. He says enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. In self-incurred immaturity, it sounds like he is scolding humanity. He defines this immaturity as the inability to use one's own understanding without guidance from another. He says the motto of the Enlightenment should be sapere aude, dare to know, dare to be wise, dare to think for yourself. And he says the main things holding us back are not a lack of intelligence, but two other things, laziness and cowardice. Because it is so easy and comfortable to remain immature. It is easier to let a book think for me, to let a priest be my conscience, to let a doctor decide my diet for me. If I can pay, I do not need to think. Thinking for yourself is hard work, and it is scary. You might be wrong. You might offend people. So he is calling for a profound intellectual courage. But he makes a very interesting and practical distinction between the public and private use of reason. In your private role, which for him means your job or your civic duty, you must obey. A soldier on duty cannot question an order. A citizen must pay their taxes. You have to follow the rules for society to function. But in your public role as a scholar, as a citizen participating in public debate, you must have absolute freedom to criticize those very same roles. You can write an article arguing that the tax system is unjust. The soldier, when he is off duty, can publish a critique of his commander's strategy. So you obey, but you argue. That is a really sophisticated way to balance order and freedom. He applied this thinking, not just to Prussia, but to the entire globe. In 1795, he wrote a text called Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. It is astonishing how it seems to predict things like the League of Nations and the UN. He looked at the world and said, nations are in a state of nature with each other. Just like Hobbes's individuals, they are like wild animals in a constant state of war or threat of war. We need to create a system to get them out of it. But he was not arguing for a single world government. He was actually afraid of that. He worried a single global state could become a soulless despotism, a global tyranny with no escape. So instead, he proposed a federation of free states, a voluntary league of nations that would agree to adjudicate their disputes peacefully. And he had some conditions for joining the club. The most important one was that every state in the federation must be a republican state, by which he meant a representative government where the citizens are the ones who consent to the laws. Why was that so important? Because of who decides to go to war. In a monarchy or a dictatorship, the ruler can decide to go to war on a whim. It is no skin off his back. He is safe in his palace. It is the people who have to do the fighting, pay the extra taxes, and see their homes destroyed. But in a republic, the citizens are the ones who have to give their consent. Kant reasoned that if the people who have to bear all the costs of war are the ones making the decision, they will be very, very reluctant to choose it. This is the core idea of what we now call democratic peace theory. The observation that liberal democracies very rarely, if ever, go to war with each other. It is also incredibly modern, and to think this is coming from a guy who never left his little corner of Russia. It speaks to the incredible power of his mind. He traveled through books. He was an avid reader of travelogues. His students said he could describe the bridges of London or the geography of the Amazon with more accuracy than people who had actually been there. We should probably touch on one more of his big ideas before we get to the end of his life. His third critique, the critique of judgment, which is about aesthetics, about beauty. For him, this was not just a little add-on. This was the book that bridged the two worlds he had created, the determined scientific world of nature and the free moral world of humanity. How do we connect them? And his answer is, through our experience of beauty and the sublime. Right? Let us start with the beautiful. For Kant, and when we judge something to be beautiful, say a flower, it is a very special kind of pleasure. It is a disinterested pleasure. That means you are not judging it based on whether it is useful, or whether you want to own it, or whether it is morally good. You just appreciate its form, the harmony of its parts. And even though it is a subjective feeling, we act as if it is universal. We say, "This flower is beautiful." Not just, "I like this flower." We expect others to agree. The sublime is a different feeling altogether. It is what you experience when you are faced with something vast, powerful, and overwhelming. Standing on the edge of the ocean during a violent storm, looking up at a massive, rugged mountain range, you feel that sense of awe, but also a little bit of terror. Your senses and your imagination are overwhelmed. They cannot take it all in. You feel physically small, powerless, like you could be crushed in an instant. But at that very same moment, your reason is not overwhelmed. Your mind can grasp the idea of the storm, the concept of the mountain. In fact, your reason can conceive of things even bigger, like infinity. In that moment, you feel a kind of triumph. You realize that even though you are physically weak, you possess a faculty, reason, that is superior to all the brute force of nature. So looking at a scary storm actually reinforces our sense of moral dignity. It is a feeling that tells us we are not just physical creatures, not just animals to be swept away by the tide. We are also rational, moral beings who belong to that other noumenal world of freedom. It is a bridge between the two realms. It is a beautiful thought, but all things must end. Let us move to the final years of his life. The machine starts to break down. It is a very sad and poignant end to the story. The man who had placed such supreme faith in the power of the human mind began to lose his own. Around the year 1800, his friends and colleagues noticed a sharp decline, what we would probably now diagnose as dementia or Alzheimer's. His short-term memories started to fail. He would have trouble finding words. He would become confused in conversation. The man who could construct these incredible cathedrals of thought could no longer string together a simple argument. But the old personality quirks, the deep-seated habits, they remained. Those were etched into his very being. He was always a micromanager of his environment. There is a famous story of a student who came to one of his lectures, and one of the buttons was missing from his coat. This bothered Kant. It completely derailed him. He could not teach. He just stood there staring at the empty spot on the student's coat. It was a disturbance in the order of the universe, and his mind could not handle it. He had to have one of the other students give the man a spare button before he could continue. And the famous sock girders. He was obsessed with circulation. He thought that normal girders, which held up your silk stockings, were a health hazard because they constricted blood flow. So he invented his own contraption. It was a kind of special pocket sewn into his trousers with a clock spring mechanism that would pull on a ribbon attached to his socks, holding them up with just the right amount of tension. That is next level hypochondria. It really is, and it continued to the very end. As his mind faded, he became more and more dependent on his friend and former student Wasiansky, who acted as his caretaker, and Wasiansky had to manage his diet, which brings us finally to the cheese. The English cheese. Kant loved it, but in his old age, his digestion was extremely weak. Wasiansky had him on a very strict, bland diet, and cheese, especially rich English cheese, was absolutely forbidden. A tragedy for any cheese lover. One day, Kant, in a moment of clarity, just started begging for a piece of cheese. He was so insistent, so pathetic, that Wasiansky finally gave in. He gave him a small piece, and Kant ate it with absolute delight. It was the last real pleasure he seems to have experienced. But shortly after, he collapsed, or he grew much weaker. Wasiansky, in his memoir, attributes Kant's final rapid decline to that one piece of forbidden cheese, death by English cheese. It is almost a fittingly eccentric end for such a man. He lingered for a little while longer. He finally passed away on February 12, 1804, just a couple of months shy of his 80th birthday. His doctor was trying to give him a spoon of water mixed with wine. Kant, who had been largely unresponsive, gathered himself, took the spoon, and said clearly, "Es ist gut. It is good." For a man who fought against his own physical frailty his entire life, who carried the weight of the universe in his mind, it is a remarkably peaceful and accepting end. His funeral was a major event. Thousands of people attended. All the church bells in Königsberg rang out. The man who had rarely left the city had become its greatest monument. They called him the Sage of Königsberg. The entire city turned out to honor the giant who had lived among them. So when we step back and look at it all, what is the grand legacy? We have walked through the life of this harness maker's son, who completely rebuilt philosophy from the ground up. He built a cathedral of thought. He did two massive things. First, he drew a line in the sand and defined the absolute limits of what human reason can know. We cannot know the thing in itself. We are, in a sense, trapped within our own minds. That sounds like a negative legacy, but it is not, because the second thing he did was, within those limits, he gave human beings an almost godlike status. By making the human mind the active creator of the world we experience, the Copernican revolution, he put humanity at the center of the universe. And by grounding morality not in God's command or in the pursuit of happiness, but in our own rationality, he gave us an incredible and terrifying responsibility. He told us we are the authors of our own moral law. We are free. We are free and we are responsible. We are not just cogs in a machine. We are ends in ourselves. It is an incredible body of work, but here's a final thought to leave everyone with. Kant said our mind shapes reality, like a pair of glasses we can never take off. If that is really true, are we ever actually seeing the world? Or are we just spending our lives wandering through a hall of mirrors that our own brains have built for us? You can take that a step further into our own age. In an age of social media feeds and algorithms that are designed to show us exactly what we want to see, that question is more urgent than ever. Kant warned us about that self-incurred immaturity. When we let an algorithm become our tutor, our guide to reality, have we lost the very courage he was calling for? Sapere aude. Dare to be wise. Maybe today that means dare to log off. Dare to question the feed. Dare to think for yourself. I do not think you could find a more Kantian message for the 21st century. If you enjoyed this journey into the mind that shaped our modern world, and you want to keep daring to be wise with us, make sure you subscribe to the History Titans channel. We have many more explorations of the figures and ideas that made us who we are coming your way. Like and share this discussion to help others find it. Thanks for joining us.